Welcome, Marty Braden here. Are spiritual cataracts blinding you? That's certainly a curious topic, isn't it? If this is your first time watching one of my videos, let me quickly explain what my channel is all about because I think it'll help you enjoy my videos more fully if you understand the why behind them. First of all, please keep in mind that I'm not a fancy high-tech production kind of YouTube expert, that's for sure, but I do think you'll enjoy my content. It's quite informative, and if you don't know much about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is often referred to as the Mormons or the Mormon Church, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I get all of my topics from my book that I recently published titled An Atheist Delusion. It's my Latter-day Saint perspective on Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. As you know, Richard's an atheist. He's also an evolutionary biologist who absolutely hates religion of any kind. In fact, he said that his purpose for writing his book was to make atheists out of all of us. Anyway, after I published An Atheist Delusion, I decided to set up this YouTube channel, record and post short videos of me reviewing every single anti-God argument Dawkins puts forth in his book. And so far, I've posted 113 videos in my series. And the video you're watching now is part 114 in that series. So I'm going to pick it up where I left off, which was the last subtitle. And that was called, if I'm not mistaken, let's get right to it so I can quote it exactly. Yeah. How moderation in faith fosters fanaticism. In this last subtitle of this chapter, which is chapter 8, Richard posits what he calls the dark side of religious absolutism, often called religious extremism or the American Taliban. Richard's main point or argument is that even mild and moderate religions helps to provide the climate of faith in which extremism naturally flourishes, end quote. I'd ask, doesn't that it sounds just like to me that atheism provides the same kind of climate for despots to flourish. It goes both ways, Richard. To lay the foundation for Richard's argument, he relates a story of 4 young British Muslims whom were living in London in 2005. They perpetrated a concerted suicide bomb attack. Richard describes them as British citizens, cricket-loving and well-mannered, just the sort of men whose company one might have enjoyed. Richard then says this is of these young men. Only religious faith is a strong enough force to motivate such utter madness in otherwise sane and decent people, end quote. This question is, why did these cricket-loving young men do it? The answer to that question, Richard appeals to another atheist, Sam Harris, for the answer. Sam says, and I quote, "The answer to this question is obvious," Sam says, if only because it has been patiently articulated ad nauseum by bin Laden himself. The answer is that men like bin Laden actually believe what they say they believe. They believe in the literal truth of the Quran. Why did 19 well-educated, middle-class men trade their lives in this world for the privilege of killing thousands of our neighbors? Because they believed they would go straight to paradise for doing so. It is rare to find that this kind of behavior of humans so fully and satisfactorily explained. Why have we been so reluctant to accept this explanation? End of Sam Harris's quote. Let me say this about what Sam Harris just said. Yes, what these men did and every other extremist have done in the name of their God is horrific and utter madness. That is no question. However, to say that it is simply because they believed they would go straight to paradise is an oversimplification. The culture these men grew up in were desperate circumstances. The stoking of hatred towards government and anyone who they believed were their enemies, and the lack of feeling any hope of getting out of such circumstances, and yes, the extreme influence of the religion they were taught from their youth and throughout their entirety of their adult life, might I say the influence of their apostate religion they grew up believing was absolutely true, that added to it as well. All of these were influencers that inspired them to cause mass murder. The mind, as well as the wet brain it brings to life, when engaged in creating thoughts that are evil, carnal, sensual, and devilish, which these men's minds in fact constructed, it can't help but produce images that are as realistic a movie as the digital movies produced by the best movie production companies in the world. Thought mapping is powerful, and like faith, it is often the moving cause of all action. This power of imagination and fantasizing magnifies one's appetites and desires, and when they are enhanced by chemicals such as dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins, The brain's chemistry fans this fantasizing flame to where the chemical reaction or reactions stimulated by these enhancing chemicals do in fact become impactful in their influence upon a person to move forward and act out their mental fantasies. Most serial killers are examples of these manifested mental gymnastics. They are products of base and licentious repeating thoughts that they have entertained day in and day out for years, and probably many times a day. The extremists that Richard uses to condemn religious absolutism have in fact constructed their specific fantasies over time, as I said. I call it embedded mental mapping, which gets laid down onto the wet brain's neuropaths, often over a period of many years, including the memory of every behavior and every evil fantasy thought that these psychopaths dreamed up. They're fruit of the fantasies of the mind mixed with the chemical soup they generated in their brains was the suicidal blowing up of hundreds of innocent victims, including themselves, on 9/11. I am not a specialist about these sorts of things by any means, but here are a few thoughts that were written by one such specialist. She's the author of the book titled Inside the Minds of Serial Killers, Why They Kill. Her name is Catherine Ramsland. Of course, most, if not all, serial killers are psychopaths, and that's a person suffering from chronic mental disorder with abnormal or violent social behavior. And they have other mental behavior disorders going on in their heads as well. Here are a few excerpts from Catherine's book where she states what's going on in the minds of these psychopathic deviants. Quote, "There are many cultural myths about serial killers," she said, "often propagated even by mental health professionals. Many assume there is a profile of a serial killer, that serial killers always go for the same victim type or always use the same MO, that they are more clever than ordinary people, and that they are inevitably charming and attractive. The truth is not as simple as that, nor is labeling extremists like Richard and Sam are doing by saying the young men were simply religious absolutists. That's not fair either. There are different types of serial killers," she says, "and while there are many books that discuss the serial killer phenomenon, especially in relationship to victim types or contexts, research have not yet been able to come up with a definitive or a definition or type or group that covers the broad spectrum of serial killers and their complex psychological dynamics," end quote. Catherine's publisher, Prager Publishers, goes on to say, quote, "Catherine looks at serial killer types, illustrating that it is difficult to accurately depict these elusive, intriguing, and dangerous killers. Her book examines a variety of serial killers, from sexual predators to psychotic killers, from murder teams to odd eccentric stalkers, in order to present the distinct psychological dynamics that set serial killers apart from other violent murderers. Among the motives addressed are lust, control, glory, profit, thrill, delusions, rage, the desire for company, the need to please a partner, and even murder as an intellectual and, yes, even religious exercise. Serial killers live double lives, hiding their violence even from those who live with them. So along with the study of motives are chapters devoted to how close associates have described killers, including parents, siblings, coworkers, lovers, and survivors. There is no profile of a serial killer, and this book establishes that in vivid and frightening detail," end of quote, of Catherine Ramsland's publisher. I believe this is true of the extremists Richard and Sam are talking about as well. There is no simple profile of an extremist like Richard and Sam Harris want to label as just being religious absolutists. I am not condoning what these nutjobs extremists did. Absolutely not. I'm just not ready to condemn a small handful of so-called cricket-loving Brits as being totally and completely driven to commit these horrific acts of murder simply because of the fruit of their religious beliefs alone, or as Richard describes it, only religious faith. It was certainly a major factor for sure. I'm not questioning that, but it was not, I repeat, it was not the only factor as Richard and Sam would have us believe. Consider what Sam said of the question, why? Here again is Sam's comments, and I quote, "The answer to this question of why is obvious. Men like bin Laden and these 4 young suicide bombers actually believe what they say they believe religiously." There's that word religiously. I find it interesting that Sam Harris, as an atheist, describes these folks' activities and their intense belief in certain things as being religiously. They believe their so-called quasi-doctrine of atheism and follow it religiously as well. And that's why I've often referred to atheism as a quasi-religion, because people adhere to it religiously and their philosophies religiously, just like Sam used here. Anyhow, the fact is, Sam and Richard have an atheist axe to grind. They hate religion and possibly even religious people themselves at times. Richard mentions a respected journalist, Muriel Gray, who in writing for the Glasgow Herald on the 24th of July of 2005 made a similar point referencing the London bombings. Richard included her comments to help bolster his argument. Here's her quote. Everyone is being blamed, from the obvious villainous duel of George W. Bush and Tony Blair to the inaction of Muslim communities. But it has never been clear that there is that absolute word only again, there is only one place to lay the blame, she says, and it has ever been thus. The cause of all this misery, mayhem, violence, terror, and ignorance is, of course, religion itself. And if it seems ludicrous to have to state such as obvious reality, the fact is that the government and the media are doing a pretty good job of pretending that it isn't so. End of quote. Again, is some form of religious motivation a factor in how these evil men's minds work? No question, absolutely. But it is not the only factor. That's what I'm trying to stress here. It is not the only factor, nor is pure religion at play here at all. There's the key here I want to make. Pure religion is not at play here. It is apostate religion that is at play here. Wrongly interpreted beliefs born from mistranslated words in their so-called holy books are what's at play, which Richard tried to delegitimize in his earlier subtitles. I must give a nod of respect to Richard and Sam for their approach, however, even though it's one-sided. Just as no prosecuting attorney worth his or her salt would introduce the other side's point of view in support of their case, so it is with Richard's and Sam's case. They don't feel they have to be fair and balanced, in other words. This being true, I'm giving you my perspective as an alternative view to their one-sided view. That way you can consider both perspectives and decide for yourselves whether or not the bombings were caused simply by religious fervor alone or that there was more to it. Richard goes on to make an interesting claim. He says, quote, our Western politicians avoid mentioning the R word, religion, and instead of characterizing their battles as a war against terror, as though terror were some kind of spirit or force with a will and a mind of its own. Did we just read Richard questioning the idea that something like terror, which is an emotion, is a kind of force with a mind and will of its own? How then can Richard suggest that natural selection is a kind of force that directs, makes you stack up, and sets up a series of things? Remember that discussion several videos back? He can't have it both ways. He's characterizing terrorism as motivated by pure evil, but then says they're not motivated by evil. However misguided we may think they are, these terrorists, motivated, like the Christian murderers of abortion doctors, by what they perceive to be righteousness, faithfully pursuing what their religion tells them, Richard says. Their religion tells them what to do, such as go and murder the innocent. Really, Richard? Just as Richard has said that science says this and science says that, he is now repeating that same error of reasoning when he tells us that religion says to do this and religion tells us to do that. Religion, like science, does not say, nor does it tell us anything. It's the men and women of science and the men and women of religion who say things about the data of science, and it's the men and women within the various religions who do all the thinking and then do the saying and the doing. It is possible that people of science and people of religion can be misguided, misdirected, and mistaken, or maybe even under the influence of evil thoughts coming from the spirit of Satan's whisperings in their minds and hearts. Or maybe could they even be influenced by their own repeating thoughts that they've conjured up from their own vain imaginations, thus driving their actions over many years of sick mental mapping? Could they have possibly imagined outrageous ideas as coming from their so-called faith or religion, and then they chose to act out on those evil imaginations? Religion, meaning religious experience, certainly does influence, but they don't make anybody do evil by holding a gun to their congregates' heads. People choose to do evil, or they choose to do good. No religion that I'm aware of forces its believers to do evil or forces them to do good under the threat of death. Just ask yourself, is your faith or lack of faith forcing you to do something bad? I have to stop here. I know the mafia, people go into that quasi-religion as far as getting the mafia and blood oaths and that kind of thing under the threat of death. They can't even leave the organization without in a body bag. So, and I guess in that sense, there's that kind of organization under the threat of death force you to do something. But that's not religion. That's not what we're talking about here. Does it force you to do something good even? Again, I would ask that you become an honest fruit inspector and listen to what comes into your heart and mind when you ask yourself these kinds of questions. The fact is that such evil ideas and imagined beliefs are far from what pure religion teaches. Again, religion does not say anything in and of itself. The same is true of pure religion. It is people themselves that go about saying that their religion teaches them to think, do, and speak in the way they do. So to Richard and Sam, I say, come on, man, lighten up. Let's not do the one-size-fits-all condemning of an entire group of people here, okay? Individuals are the ones doing the evil things. That said, I will agree that false religion does provide a climate for such antisocial religious behaviors to flourish, as does atheism. But I also submit that pure religion, understood properly, absolutely does not. Absolutely does not. Richard continues with his diatribe against religionists, saying, quote, they are not psychotic. They are religious idealists who, by their own lights, are rational. They perceive their acts to be good, not because they have been possessed by Satan, but because they have been brought up from the cradle to have total and unquestioning faith. If that isn't a biased, bigoted opinion, which means obstinately or unreasonably attached to a belief, opinion, or faction, in particular prejudiced against or antagonistic toward a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular group, that's a long way of saying bigoted, and that's what Richard just expressed, then I don't know what bigoted is, if that's not what it is. Having lived in the land of the free and the home of the brave, as an American, I have and continue to enjoy religious freedom, at least so far. Our nation's founding fathers had the wisdom to establish laws that protect this freedom so that as an American citizen, I am able to enjoy the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of my own conscience. And I allow all men the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. But that privilege cannot be expressed outside of the law. If it is, then the full weight of the law must be applied to any such lawbreaker. I do not believe in allowing extremists, or anyone else for that matter, to cross the line of religious freedom over to the side of lawlessness in the name of one's God, where they commit heinous acts of violence in the name of their religion and God. For example, having been motivated by the lure of their heightened visions of grandeur and the promised pleasures of paradise, apparently 70 wives each, these cricket players stepped out of the bounds of the law and murdered people. That's not expressing religious freedom. That's breaking the law. As long as anyone stays on the sides of the law and allows everyone's religious freedom to be expressed freely within the law so that everyone can enjoy the privilege of worshiping whom or what they choose to worship, or to not worship anything or anyone at all, if that's their choice, then we can live in peace and harmony. This religious freedom was granted to every American by our Constitution, both the freedom of and the freedom from religion under the law. Let me share what Richard and Sam Harris said about the lure of paradise that these terrorists imagined in their warped minds. I won't quote the entire statement, but I will give the last paragraph to make my point. Here it is, and I quote, the young men and the planner then knelt and placed their right hands on the Quran. The planner said, quote, are you ready? Tomorrow you will be in paradise, end quote. This promise that tomorrow you will be in paradise is, of course, a statement of false doctrine, born of apostasy, because if you are a murderer, you certainly will not be going to paradise. It's a brief belief born of apostasy, and it's steeped in falling away from the pure truth and the pure religion that existed from the beginning. Would I prefer they come to believe in the pure gospel of Jesus Christ? Absolutely yes. But as I said, I believe in allowing all men the privilege of worshiping as they choose, as long as their acts of worship don't cross the line where they break the law, such as committing mass murder as these extremists did. When someone crosses that line, they forfeit their privileges and must be made subject to the consequences and full extent of the law, and hopefully the fear of suffering the punishment that is commensurate with their crime will keep them and others from stepping over the line. Richard and Sam are correct when they say, quote, these people actually believe what they say they believe. I know that's true. And why they believe can lead to their acting out on the fantasies that they have finally reached their emotional peak, and that peak for them was to blow themselves and others up. but you cannot hang their behavior and their evil that it resulted in on the shoulders of pure, undefiled religion. If you do, then you're just being prejudiced towards religion in general, which Richard, Sam, and other atheists like Richard has quoted throughout his book. All seem to be that prejudice. Richard manifests his prejudice, biased, and bigoted opinion when he says such things like the following statement, and I quote, "The take-home message is that we should blame religion itself, not religious extremism, as though that were some kind of terrible perversion of real decent religion." Richard is trying to remove the possibility that there is any such thing as pure religion or real or decent religion. Voltaire got it right long ago when he said, Richard said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities," end quote. Well, using the words "make you" in this quote implies that someone is holding something like a gun to someone's head or is threatening someone in such a way that it makes that person believe something that's absurd when they don't want to believe it or do it. Nobody makes anybody think a certain way. I would say that Voltaire used a poor choice of words here. He had better serve his readers if he had said something like this: "Those who can convince you to believe absurdities can probably convince you to commit atrocities." I hope by now you understand the point that I've been trying to make here. Next, Richard once again shares his scientific atheistic logic when he says, quote, "As long as we accept the principle that religious faith must be respected simply because it is religious faith, it is hard to withhold respect from and for that faith of Osama bin Laden and the suicide bombers. The alternative, one so transparent that it should not need any urging, is to abandon the principle of automatic respect for religious faith. I'm not convinced that it is automatically religious respect out there. This is one reason why I do everything in my power," Richard says, "to warn people against faith itself, not just against so-called extremist faith. The teachings of moderate religion, though not extremist in themselves, are an open invitation to extremism," Richard says, end quote. As I've said many times, this is just Richard's opinion. In my Latter-day Saint mind, Richard has failed to come to an understanding of the differences between true and pure religion, which Richard called real, decent, or moderate religion, versus apostate or moderately defiled religion. I give Richard once again a little slack here because what he sees in the many false religions of our day is apostasy's fruit, fully ripened on its many trees. It is these fruits of apostasy, I believe, that have led Richard to a state to make legitimate claims about these apostate religions, but they are not legitimate claims about pure, undefiled religion. There's such a big difference. Here is an excerpt from a talk given by Kent B. Jackson, an assistant professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University, that I want to share with you because it relates perfectly to this topic of apostasy, and I quote, "The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has proclaimed to the world consistently since its beginning in the mid-early century of the 19th century that there was an apostasy of the church founded by Jesus during his Palestinian ministry and led by his apostles following his ascension shortly thereafter. This is a fundamental belief of the Latter-day Saints. If there had not been an apostasy, there would have been no need for restoration. Latter-day Saints theology asserts that the church established by the Savior and led by his apostles in the old world came to an end within a century after its formation. The doctrines which its inspired leaders taught were corrupted and changed by others not so familiar with the Spirit, with inspiration, and the authority to act in God's name was taken from the earth. And none of the Christian systems that existed after those developments, though they did and do good things, enjoyed divine endorsement as the Lord's own church. In Joseph's History 1 verse 19 it says, "I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong, and the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight." Let me pause right there. So I'm not saying the Christians are an abomination. The creeds that are false creeds, that are apostate creeds, those are what was directed to the personages of the Father and the Son towards, and particularly Jesus, who said this. All the creeds were an abomination in his sight. That those professors were all corrupt. They had corrupted the doctrines, and they're teaching corrupted doctrines from the early first century after Christ ascended. It's changed completely from what those early saints were taught by Christ and the apostles. "They draw near to me," it says, with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. So, this is the fruit of apostasy. I'm not condemning Christian brothers and sisters. I'm using the same words. The creeds are an abomination because they don't teach the pure truth. It's been corrupted, it's been defiled, and that is abominable because you don't have the saving truths that Christ taught the apostles clearly defined in all the 46,000 churches and denominations throughout the world today. It should be obvious to the honest truth seeker. In Doctrine and Covenants 130 it says, and also those to whom these commandments are given might have power to lay the foundation of this church and to bring it forth out of obscurity and out of darkness, the only true and living church upon the face of the whole earth, with which I, the Lord, am well pleased, speaking into the church collectively and not individually. In other words, there's Latter-day Saints where all have sinned, but as a collective church and in the organization he set up through Revelation, that is what he is pleased with, not the wickedness of the people and their failures to live up to what a disciple of Christ should be and act like. Possibly the best single witness of the apostasy of the New Testament Christianity, this good brother says, is the New Testament itself. The New Testament writers prophesied that apostasy would take place in the church and that the church, in fact, would be overtaken by it. Just as significantly, the New Testament actually records that apostasy was happening even as their records were being written. I remember reading about Paul. I won't go through the verses until, but Paul spoke of people who were at his side and served him as he worked amongst the Ephesians and this group and that group. But now they're turning against him and turning against the church. That is the fruit of apostasy that is recorded in the New Testament happening right then. As time progressed, the heresies against which the apostles contended became increasingly virulent and successful, as the record attests. Near at the end of the first century, the apostolic record came to a sudden close. End quote. End of excerpts. The full talk can be found by searching Early Signs of the Apostasy, that's the title, at churchofjesuschrist.org. My point in sharing this is simple. It is disingenuous for Richard to place Christ's pure religion and its pure doctrine into the group that Richard has placed all religions in, saying religious extremism is not some kind of terrible perversion of real, decent, or what I'm calling pure religion, end quote. This statement shows Richard's ignorance of how apostasy ravages pure religion after God reveals it to his children through his apostles and prophets. Once the original apostles and prophets were killed off, the Christians were left to fend for themselves. In other words, to be a law unto themselves and making subjective interpretations of it and rules and leaders who weren't God ordained, and he didn't choose them through revelation and having the same authority passed down. That's what I'm saying. It was a subjective interpretation of leading the church going forward and leading to a great falling away where the generations that followed had a religion that had a form of godliness. It had a form of godliness. Many truths still amongst it in the mix, but it denied the power and keys thereof. It denies revelation. Oh, it's all stopped. Revelation no more. We don't need it no more. It's all right here in this living word of God. I'm not disrespecting the Bible, but it says contains all that God has said, all that he would ever say. Even if he had things to say, it should be sought out just in the Bible. He doesn't speak to his children anymore. And that's denying the power of revelation. It's denying the priesthood keys that administers this gospel to keep it pure and good. In other words, the pure fullness of Jesus Christ's gospel have been replaced by the precepts of men mingled with Scripture. Richard repeats his firm belief that, and I quote, more generally, and this applies to Christianity no less than to Islam, what is really pernicious is the practice of teaching children that faith is a virtue. I want to read a little quote here. I'm going to pull this out. I had it here. It's called Flashes of Truth by Stephen Lund, September 2022. You can go to churchofjesuschrist.org and type in Flashes of Light by Stephen Lund and it'll pop up. But this is just a quote from a fantastic talk. He says, Heavenly Father purposely designed and ordered our world to require us to walk in faith. It's a purposely designed plan. He pressed into place the pieces of this sophisticated jigsaw puzzle of mortality, but held back a few of the pieces, which he keeps in his pocket to ensure that faith is required as we come up against the gaps in this puzzle's spiritual landscape. That's called the gaps that people jump on to say that we try to put God in those gaps. That's not what he's talking about here. There are holes that we don't know that forces every one of God's children on this planet, believers, non-believers alike, to have to exercise when you get pushed finally into the corner, because it's not all there in facts and obvious, here I am, I'll take away all your freedom, all your religious beliefs, all your opportunity to exercise faith. I'm just going to stand before you, and I'm here, I'm God. It all goes away. That's not his plan. He keeps in his pocket to ensure that faith is required as we come up against the gaps in the puzzle spiritual landscape. He has ensured that we will not be able to game the system by thinking our way to heaven. To discover him through provable math or science, which would obliviate faith and foreclose the purposes of mortality. In other words, it will destroy the purpose of mortality, why we came here, to exercise faith, to prove ourselves worthy, to develop our spiritual attunement skills and the sensitivities that we should have, and to become like Christ and progress line upon line, precept by precept. That requires faith. That's the moving cause of all action, and that's the kind of faith that I stand for. Faith, to Richard, this means any kind of religious faith is evil, precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. He says teaching children that unquestioned faith is what he's referring to, is a virtue, primes them, given certain other ingredients that are not hard to come by, to grow up into potentially lethal weapons for future jihads or crusades, immunized against fear by the promise of a martyr's paradise. The authentic faith head deserves a high place in history. Faith, he said, and I put this little thought here, I think Richard is still referring to unquestioned faith here, at least I hope so. He says faith can be very, very dangerous, and to deliberately implant it into the vulnerable mind of an innocent child is a grievous wrong. It is to childhood itself and the violation of childhood by religion that we turn in the next chapter, end quote. So he's really coming down on these extremist faith and putting all religion and faith into the same pot here. One size fits all, which I disagree with. Unlike what Richard says of theists, I do not have nor do I believe in unquestioned faith, or blind faith as Richard suggests all theists do. I'm confident that as you have been listening to my video here, my perspective on Richard's argument so far, you have come to understand why I say that one only needs to become a fruit inspector and review the action behaviors of any of these various devotees of various religions to conclude that the pure gospel as it was once observed, even the pure gospel of the true and living God, has in fact been corrupted and defiled. Anyone of a sound and open mind would know that God would never require his devotees to commit the kind of unproven or unprovoked acts of senseless murder that the cricket-loving Islamist Richard spoke about. It's not my intent here to ridicule Richard or any of the religions of the world, including Islam, evangelical or Catholics or Christians, but I do see Richard as being spiritually blinded by spiritual cataracts of hatred and bias towards God and religion of any kind. Richard developed these spiritual cataracts early on by reading books that contain only half-truths, as well as associating with other atheists with his same worldview eye disease, and as a result these spiritual cataracts have confined Richard to a view of life that is full of spiritual darkness, a life where religious bigotry and the spirit of Satan reigns freely in his and other atheist minds. Richard's bigotry manifests itself in his obstinate and what I feel is an unreasonable attachment to atheism and evolution, which often produces prejudice against any person who claims membership in any form of religion or declares their faith and belief in God as our creator and not accepting evolution's natural selection as the creator and director of all living things. These spiritual cataracts have kept and continue to keep Richard and more than half the world's population blinded spiritually and unable to recognize the pure gospel of Jesus Christ for what it truly is. It's part of that accusatory fog of the brethren that's put out there for us to stumble and become a stumbling block to us. God's plan of happiness and redemption for his children is what we're all in search for. This spiritual blindness made by these spiritual cataracts is one more reason I feel I have license to say that Richard suffers from an atheist delusion from these spiritual cataracts. Okay, that's the end of this subtitle, and it's ready to go on chapter 9. And it's an interesting topic. It says childhood abuse and the escape from religion. You're going to find that quite an intriguing topic. But I just want to close here and say this, that I love anyone who desires to find and seek out if there is a God, and if they have a God, to seek out a relationship with him, one that helps edify you, and that gives you peace and gives you hope. And then you have a desire to study and to learn so you can answer all the questions that might come at you because of the hope that you do have. I don't care what your faith is. I'm hoping that that's how you feel about it. Of course, I believe the pure gospel of Jesus Christ in its fullness was restored through his instrument and the instrumentality of Joseph Smith, the prophet, in the early 1900s, 1820, 1830, 1840, during those 26 years. Incredible things happened, and such persecution, I can't fathom all that was stolen from the saints, women that were raped, murders that took place, property that was stolen, homes that were burned to the ground, property within the homes taken and pillaged, and on and on and on it goes. Accusation after accusation after accusation, many of which were from people who were the closest friends of Joseph, in the highest of positions, in the first presidency, in the quorum of 12 apostles. And when they were offended, or when they broke the commandments, or become licentious and adulterous, and they were brought out and caught and put to the test, and found to be guilty, and then excommunicated, they became the enemies and gathered in and mid meetings and all that kind of thing. That is and many of them went and started their own apostate church because they felt Joseph was a fallen prophet. I mean, I could go on. The book's called Saints. There's 4 volumes. Incredible history. I'll just simply say that if you're truly a truth seeker, you should do some investigation, lift up that rock, and you won't find worms crawling underneath the log or the rock. You'll find a beautiful, happy people. You'll find the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to be true, and have had prophets since Joseph's time, one after another as they passed away. We now have President Nelson. He is in his 99th year, and soon if he finishes another year or so, he'll be 100, a centurion. My goodness. But if you listen to his talks, you check the fruit on the tree, hear the words out of his mouth, and look at the life that he's led. He's truly a prophet of God, and I love him. And I hope this particular video has helped you to understand why and how I feel about apostasy, and how I feel about this view Richard and other atheists have about religion, how they've lumped it all in. There is a difference. Be able to separate it. That's the power of discernment. That's the gift of discernment. And I hope you have the gift of discernment that'll help you to not buy into this lie, this bigotry against all religion and religionists and theists and believers. There are some crazy people out there, no question. There are some psychopaths that do incredibly wicked things, but that you can't lay that on everybody who happens to be a believer and put us all in the same pot. I'm sorry, Richard. You're just wrong in doing that. So I'm going to close off now and have you write your thoughts and type in any question you have, and I'll do my best to get back to it as soon as I can. Oh, and I'm going to be a little selfish here for a second, just ask you, if you like this particular video and you have never done it before, check out my other videos, but go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the bell so that you get a notice when my new one comes out each day or every other day, so you can be the first to receive it. It would really help the algorithm start to see there's something starting to bubble here with the channel, An Atheist Delusion, Marty Braden author, and it'll be able to get the message out to more people and create a variety of folks to be able to see it. I'd love to have even more and have their interplay in the comments section. It'll be great. So help me out if you feel okay with that. If you don't, that's okay. I just wanted to ask and remind that can be done. Hit subscribe and it would really help me. So until next time, I want to wish you continued success. Goodbye.